since its inception. So since the start of the genocide, occupation forces have abducted 360 healthcare workers among the total of around 6,600 Gazans that have been incarcerated. Over 100 remain in detention. Initially, the vast majority of detainees from Gaza were held in newly established detention camps or in repurposed military bases. And this meant that this prevented families from knowing anything about their incarcerated loved ones, since there was no one being released from these detention camps to relay news about them. So most detainees from Gaza have been held and continue to be held, actually, under the Unlawful Combatants Law. This was passed in 2002, and it's just one among a labyrinth of Israeli laws that regulate the colonial carceral regime that allows the torture of Palestinian detainees among one of its stipulations. And this is under the euphemism of what's called moderate physical pressure. And this carceral regime also allows the detention of Palestinians for months on end without trial or charges, up to 24 months, 6 months, up to 6 months, which is renewable up to 4 times. The Unlawful Combatants Law in particular was amended in December 2023 to allow the military to hold people for 45 days without any court oversight or an arrest warrant. And the law now allows prison officers to deny prisoners access to a lawyer for 75 days, and it allows courts to extend detention and deny access to a lawyer for up to 180 days. That's about 6 months without access to a lawyer and with a detention that essentially no one knows about. On top of this, prison authorities have made it almost impossible for detainees from Gaza to gain access to a lawyer because they require lawyers to possess a hard copy of a direct power of attorney. This needs to be signed by detainees' relatives, who are almost always in Gaza, and therefore inaccessible due to the siege imposed. Eventually, the secrecy of these detention camps was broken, and details started to emerge of the conditions Palestinians were being held in. An Israeli doctor revealed in April the existence of the Sdei Taman detention facility and the horrors that occupation forces were inflicting there. The doctor raised concern to Israeli ministers that what was happening in that detention facility, violated even Israeli law. He described how Palestinians were identified and addressed by their serial numbers, never by their names, how they were held in large uninsulated tents, blindfolded and fed through straws, with all 4 of their limbs shackled 24/7, causing amputation due to handcuff injuries to become a routine event. The doctor reported that there was often only one doctor on duty, often without the appropriate qualifications, leading to medical complications and death. He reported that he couldn't believe that an Israeli prison guard could do such a thing. The thing being dehumanization and torture, which Israeli prison guards have notoriously done, and the Israeli medical establishment has defended and participated in for decades. In fact, even in Sdei Taman, Physicians for Human Rights reported that detainees are restrained and blindfolded even during medical treatment. The healthcare workers and students in the audience may be shocked to hear this, but there has been decades of evidence building of Israeli healthcare professionals' participation and complicity in the torture of Palestinian detainees. As early as the 1990s, there were global calls for the Israeli Medical Association and the broader medical establishment to speak out against and stop participating in the torture of Palestinian prisoners. The Israeli Medical Association not only distanced itself from these accusations, but it even outright denied that Israeli prison authorities even conducted systematic torture despite the piles of evidence. Over the years, up to and including this month, Palestinians have spoken out about their experiences of doctors facilitating, participating in, and ignoring their torture, in addition to medical neglect. Since the 7th of October 2023 in particular, medical consultations are often concluded with Israeli prison service doctors or nurses telling a sick Palestinian prisoner to just drink water. The testimonies of Palestinian prisoners have led international, Palestinian, and even Israeli organizations to call on Israeli doctors to cease their complicity in the torture of Palestinian prisoners, to no avail. Back to State Taman, more whistleblowers came forward after April 2024. Lawyers managed to maneuver their way into previously unknown torture facilities, and some detainees eventually started to be released. This provided details about the systematic dehumanization and torture inflicted on Palestinian detainees, including sleep deprivation, beatings, denial of medical treatment, and systematic rape. The uncovering of these horrific conditions, including a particularly horrific case of a videotaped gang rape of a Palestinian detainee, triggered a debate within Israeli society about whether Israeli jailers and soldiers had the right to rape Palestinians. These debates even took place within the parliament and included a rush to defend the rapists, from Israeli ministers and parliamentarians right down to armed mobs who stormed military bases to defend the rapists. 4 healthcare workers have been killed while detained by occupation forces. I should say at least 4 healthcare workers were killed while detained by occupation forces. Dr. Adnan al-Bursh, Dr. Iyad al-Rantisi, the paramedic Hamdan al-Naba, and nurse Ziad al-Dalu. Dr. Iyad al-Rantisi was detained on one of the so-called safe corridors connecting North and South Gaza on the 10th of November 2023. He died 6 days after his detention, but his death was not announced until 7 months later, on the 18th of June 2024, and it was reported in an Israeli newspaper. That's how his family found out that he had been tortured to death. Hamdan al-Naba was abducted on the 2nd of December 2023 while transferring patients from a Shifa hospital to southern Gaza, to a hospital there, on a safe corridor in a pre-approved convoy. His family was informed of his death in September 2024. It's not known when he died. Ziad al-Dalu was detained in a raid on a Shifa hospital on 18th of March 2024. His death was announced in September 2024. I do not omit details for brevity. I omit them because these are the only details available. There is a bit more known about the killing of Dr. Adnan al-Bursh. He was detained from Al-Auda Hospital in Jabalia on the 5th of December 2023. The Israeli military announced that it would destroy the hospital on top of everyone in it if the male staff did not evacuate the hospital. Once they did, Dr. al-Bursh was abducted alongside 10 other staff members. He was taken to State Taman 2 weeks later, on the 19th of December. And a doctor who was detained with him reported that upon his arrival, Dr. al-Bursh appeared to have already been beaten heavily, had breathing difficulties, could not use the toilet without help, and believed that he also had broken ribs. The Israeli army claims that it transferred Dr. al-Bursh to the Israeli prison service the next day, the 20th of December. His whereabouts are unknown from that point until mid-April 2024, 4 months, when he was transferred to Ofir prison, next to Ramallah in the occupied West Bank. A fellow prisoner reported that Dr. al-Bursh had arrived in a devastating state. He was bearing evidence of severe physical assault, was stripped, and thrown by prison guards in the middle of the yard in the prison. He was unable to stand and was helped into his cell by fellow prisoners. A few minutes later, his cellmates screamed for help, and Dr. Adnan al-Bursh had died. The bodies of these 4 health workers continue to be held by the Israeli prison service, alongside the bodies of 580 known Palestinians and the bodies of up to 1,500 unknown Palestinians who have been killed in or around Gaza since the 7th of October 2023. The intensification of the violence inflicted through Israel's detention and prison system is just that. It's an intensification of a long history of that violence. Occupation authorities have long subjected Palestinian detainees and prisoners to inhumane and dehumanizing conditions. Palestinians are usually detained from their homes in the middle of the night in heavily armed raids where soldiers break into their homes and ransack them, beat detainees and their families too, blindfold detainees and cuff their hands to the back, which is more painful than the front. And the soldiers rarely, if ever, produced arrest orders. Once apprehended, detainees are often kept waiting while blindfolded and handcuffed, either in military jeeps or in an interrogation center later, with a continuation of the beatings along the way. Once at an interrogation center, detainees are deprived of sleep and subjected to prolonged interrogation sessions, usually handcuffed throughout them. Interrogations usually include slapping and threats, and often with more severe beatings and painful stress positions that they're held in for hours. Detainees are usually held in solitary confinement during interrogation in windowless, cold cells while deprived of basic needs, including hygiene products. They're denied access to lawyers and contact with their families during the interrogation period, which can last anything from a few hours to several months. Since the 7th of October 2023, Palestinian detainees and prisoners have been denied all family visits and all visits by the International Committee of the Red Cross. And lawyer visits have been heavily curtailed and surveyed. These practices have come to be understood within the broader carceral system imposed by the colonial authorities on Palestinians from the very start of the occupation of Palestine. This system has been designed to subjugate Palestinians and eliminate our collectivity and resistance through a web of fragmentation and repression. This means that the carceral system extends beyond prison walls. In 1948, Zionist militias backed by the world's imperial powers founded the state of Israel on the ruins of hundreds of Palestinian villages. Although 800,000 Palestinians were forced to flee, 700,000 managed to stay. But they were concentrated mainly in fewer towns and villages, as there was internal displacement too. And once the state of Israel was established, Palestinians who remained were subjected to military rule until 1966 for 18 years, which required them to obtain permits to leave their village or town, even if they had lands or homes outside the towns they were displaced to, or needed to, for example, seek healthcare or visit a relative. The same system was then applied once Israel occupied the West Bank, Jerusalem, and the Gaza Strip, and became increasingly institutionalized as Israel built a network of hundreds of settlements. They also established military bases and designated military zones and national parks to cut Palestinians off from each other. In the West Bank today, this fragmentation is supported by the notorious 9-meter apartheid wall, fences, a segregated road network, one for Palestinians and one for settlers, and around 900 checkpoints and electronic gates. There are individuals who are surveyed with additional security, with bans from traveling outside the West Bank, or even sometimes bans from leaving their own town or village. The Gaza Strip, after the Palestinian factions forced the Israeli army to pull out and dismantle the settlements, was turned into the world's biggest open-air prison, with severe restrictions imposed on the movement of people and goods, especially since 2007, meaning that every single child in the Gaza Strip has only ever lived in Gaza under the siege. Israeli authorities boasted about keeping Palestinians on a diet, carefully calculating the number of calories they allowed in, too few to allow Palestinians to live a dignified life, but enough to stave off starvation and death. This siege also included a total ban on large parts of the healthcare sector, including medical disposables, devices, medicines, and parts for water treatment plants and electric generators. On top of this, since 1967, it is estimated that Israel has subjected over 800,000 Palestinians from the West Bank and the Gaza Strip to some form of detention. That's around 40% of the adult male population, held in the conditions that I detailed above. These overlaying levels of fragmentation, isolation, and repression led Palestinian writer Walid Daqqa, who died while incarcerated on the 7th of April 2024, 38 years into his imprisonment, to describe the Israeli carceral regime as putting Palestinians in the large prisons, their places of living, which are reproduced into prisons through geographic and political fragmentation, and the small prisons in which Palestinians are held in small confinement in the conditions that I described. It is then important to consider the whole colonial apparatus as a carceral regime that aims to control Palestinian lives and re-engineer Palestinian social and political consciousness. I want to end on the global implications of the system. The genocide in Gaza and the siege from 2007 onwards are arguably the most extreme form of necropower ever witnessed. Israel has attempted to put Palestinians in a limbo between life and death, or a protracted state of living death. But this must not be considered the exception. We see the same tactics copied by the occupation forces being inflicted in Jenin refugee camp in the last couple of weeks, from where the vast majority of residents have now been forced to flee. Over 3,000 families, around 500,000 people out of 24,000 who lived there, have now fled the refugee camp. These assaults on Palestinians are used by the Israeli government and arms companies to advertise the capabilities of and opportunities for weapons and technologies of war. Google and Microsoft, among others, have deepened their ties with the Israeli colonial regime, and arms manufacturers have had their shares increase their shares increase in value, and sales shoot up since the 7th of October 2023. And this emphasizes that unless we win in a struggle against imperialism and colonialism worldwide, these technologies will be used to subjugate, repress, and kill other populations around the world that are considered surplus for global capital. So this emphasizes the global dimensions of the Palestinian struggle and what the writer Anthony Lowenstein refers to as the Palestine Laboratory, the large carceral regime that the colonial authorities have imposed on the people of Palestine. Thank you.